Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Rhodes Talk of this semester. I'm Mark Blythe. I'm the director of the Rhodes Centre. And this is Charlotte Cavaille, who we tried to have as the first talk of the fall semester, and then COVID intervened. So we're glad to have her back sans COVID. Charlotte got in touch with me and sent me her book when it first came out. And I was really glad to get it because I've been thinking for a long time, and I'm going to do a podcast on this, and we've done some recording. You're going to be juxtaposed with Branko Milanovic.
Oh, nice.
On this one, which is, you remember when Piketty brought out his book on inequality, and Obama at one point even sort of said, this is the defining challenge, whatever. And it never seems to be. It never actually filters into politics. And I've always wondered why. I mean, the data is there, the numbers are there, people seem to care about it, whatever. And, it's a bit one of those sort of things where ultimately, if you really are going to figure this out, you're going to have to go to a much more refined micro level and actually look at real data and try and figure out why it is that people don't really care about inequality or care about it under specific circumstances. And what are those circumstances? Because that then tells you something very interesting about how you are likely to get a progressive politics or not, or a regressive politics, as it more often seems to be. So Charlotte is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan at the Ford School of Public Policy. Her book's Fair Enough, Support for Redistribution in the Age of Inequality. And you're going to be much smarter than you are now in 45 minutes. So there you go.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks. That's a nice sort of thing about contribution. Yes, please. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. This is great. And unfortunately, in my neck of the woods, we don't really do book talks anymore. And so this is really a unique, awesome experience. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Mark, for having me. So I'm going to talk about this book that came out a year ago. The book cover is from my brother, actually, so it's a family project. So what is in the book? So broadly speaking, it's a study of the demand side of redistributive politics. Oh, sorry, yes. Yeah, I do tend to walk around, so I'm going to have to, we're good. Okay. So it's a book on the demand side of redistributive politics, and Mark kind of explained why that is interesting. Why don't people care that much? To some extent, I am answering that question, even though the book is not framed exactly around that question. And so here I'm focusing on post-industrial democracies, especially after the 70s. So we are in the quote-unquote neoliberal era. I'm not talking about what happened on the demand side during the New Deal period, for instance. There's not good data there. The other thing is, and so for the folks, again, I think it's a diverse crowd, but who's familiar with Luke's Three Faces of Power? There are a few folks. Okay. This is a book on thinking about phase 3. I don't say that in the book because I wasn't tenured when I wrote it. But if you're interested, I wrote about it more explicitly and I can forward you. But you'll see it says something about Luke's third phase. And then basically, if you're working with public opinion data, it's a theory of how people answer survey questions about redistributive policies. And so if you're kind of super applied, you can still learn stuff, even if you're not familiar with Luke's work. So that's kind of the content. So let me give you, in the next 25 minutes, the gist of the book. So what is kind of the motivating puzzle of the book? It's one that I think is typical among academics that tend to be more on the left, which is what I call it the missing left turn. Came to the US after the Great Recession, and I was just very puzzled why, given all the economic turmoil, the left wasn't doing that well in Europe. In particular, I'm French. I was raised in France. And so here I'm just going to put it in numbers. So I came to the United States thinking about Europe, but then I discovered at this time Piketty was dumping all this data. And so on the right here for the United States, you basically have the share of national income that goes to the top 10%. The great decompression until the 80s when it shots back up. And so kind of mechanically, this is the share of the bottom 60%. So the majority, a bit more of the people, it's going down. The UK is also a country in Europe that has similar patterns. As you can see, they're not as dramatic, but you get these similar trends of an increase in the share going to the top 10% and overall mechanically a decrease for the bottom 60. Interestingly, with the Great Recession, the UK low growth seems to be good for equality, or bad for inequality in this case. But looking at this, I was of course thinking, why isn't this type of situation where you have people caring about inequality and redistribution? And so I thought, why do I think they should be caring? And so implicit in my puzzlement was this idea, well, it's in their interest. Like, you don't even need to have the whole philosophy. It's just like, there's money up there. Let's just take it, right? And so, of course, it might not be the right way to think about this, but that was ultimately the assumptions I was bringing to this puzzle. So this is the puzzle driving the book. Why are we not seeing more support for redistribution or at least mobilization around this? Some of it is actually happening in the US, so we can talk about this in the Q&A, given that it's in their interest. So how do we know that people are not, or the populace or the people in general, the bottom 60% is not asking for more redistribution? So there we turn to survey data. So this is a general social survey. They have been asking a question that is as follows. Think of a score of 1, meaning that the government should not concern itself with reducing income differences, and a score of 7, as meaning that the government ought to reduce the income differences between rich and poor. So I take that item, it's been asked repeatedly over time, and I separate, just to help you out a little bit, between folks who on average pick an answer that signals that they think the government ought to reduce income differences. There is neither option, so folks who don't commit, and then folks who are actually on average putting an answer that is no government action. And so basically, I can plot the data however I want. This is one way that I like to present it, but there's fluctuation, but overall things are quite stable on the long run, okay? So there's not a decline in the US case, but on average, things are pretty stable. There are a few seats. There's one here if you guys want to come and sit in the front. So maybe while the average is stable, at least we're seeing some reshuffling under the hood, which is that even if on average things are not changing, are we seeing the rich getting a little anxious about redistribution and the poor getting a bit more enthusiastic, and they might cancel each other out, resulting in the stable trend? Well, here what I've plotted is my attempt with this data to look at the income gap in these answers. So here, basically what it means, we're in the positive. Each of these dots is telling us the difference in, here I've coded it as opposition to redistribution between the rich and the poor. And so this means that the rich on average more opposed to redistribution than the poor. Think top 20% versus bottom 20% of the income distribution. However, as you can see, this gap is declining over time. Okay, so it's like, not only are things stable, under the hood, income is less and less of a predictor over time of attitudes towards redistribution. Turning to the UK, I got into an even more puzzling set of trends. On the top here is the data I can get from the British election study. Kind of unfortunately stops in the mid-2000s. And the bottom here, it's data from the British Social Attitude Survey. These are the 2 best surveys available in the UK, high quality. That's the ones you can trust. One is a question that basically asks agreement with a question that is worded as follows: income and wealth should be redistributed towards ordinary working people. Okay? This one here mentions the poor. It says, government should redistribute income from the better off to those who are less well off. I plot percentage that agree. If I take the BES, I see something quite stable. Fluctuation again, but on average, there's no trend. If I look at this data set, I'm seeing over time a decline in the people who agree that the government should redistribute, in this case, from the better off to the well off. So I was like, okay, not only in the UK it's not stable, well, it depends which data set. And the data set that picks up a trend, it's going down, it's not going up. I further looked at income differences, like I did for the US, and they're actually in the UK, it's messy, relatively stable. There's a gap. The rich tend to be more opposed to redistribution than the poor, but no trend. So basically, what the heck? So this is the book. And so the book is trying to propose a parsimonious theory that can explain trends in the US, trends in the UK, varying income gaps, and speak to other countries. So I have also Germany and France in there, and hopefully it speaks more generally, but there are some data limitations, so I can't test it everywhere. So what I'm going to do today is summarize the argument and then move to test of the argument that speaks to these puzzles. I won't be able to cover everything. Unfortunately, this is not a book that fits in article format. So if you're interested, you're going to have to buy it. Great, I get the royalties, but I'm not doing that for that. It's really, unfortunately, really hard to package. If you're interested in this one book chapter, what I've tried to get at some of the arguments, if you want to read that or assign that, email me. I can give you ways around reading the book, but there aren't that many. So let's jump into the argument. So I'm going to talk about fairness. It's in the title, but let me walk you through it. And this is in a way in which I think I overlap with your earlier work here quite strongly. So I thought, okay, if I expect people from a kind of self-serving economic perspective to look at rising inequality and want to tax the rich, well, to reason in a self-serving kind of materialist way, about government redistribution, you need to answer two questions when you're reasoning about government policy in general. Will I be affected by this policy, and how will I be affected? Okay? And so to some extent, to reason like a rational economic actor in a self-interested way, you need to be able to answer these questions with relative certainty. Am I affected? No, yes. If I'm affected, is it a lot? Is it a decent amount? Is it not so much? And so when can I start kind of reasoning in a selfish way about economic policy? It's if I know I'm going to be affected and affected a lot. And I think you can expect kind of selfish reasoning in that situation. The problem is, for most of us, we can't even answer these questions, or where we can, we maybe know we're going to be affected, but how much is really hard to pull out. It's just, politics is complicated. It's big kind of second order consequences. It plays out over, several months, years, if not generation. So a lot of the time when we're thinking about a policy, it's an unknown quantity. We don't know how we're going to be personally affected. So in this context, it's really hard to reason like, a selfish economic agent. Under some circumstances, you can, but most of the time you can't. So what happens when you can't? How do you form preferences over redistributive, in this specific case, redistributive government policies, when these consequences are uncertain? And this is where I get obsessed with fairness reasoning. So I'll present the book today, but I'm still working on these issues of how people think about fairness and justice. And so feel free, in the Q&A to give me new research ideas and stuff, because it's still an ongoing research agenda. So what do I mean by fairness reasoning? So I'm going to try to kind of simplify this. There's a lot going on in the book. So here, I'm going to kind of go to the data I'm using in the book, which is the survey data. So I'm asked a survey question about a redistributive social policy. Well, if I can't answer it in a way that is shaped by my self-interest, because I have no clue how I'm going to be affected by this policy, I'm going to try to say something else. I'm going to say the fair thing. I'm going to try to pick the fair answer. So what does that mean? I'm going to pick an answer, a policy preference that maximizes fairness, that increases fairness. What do I mean by that? I'm going to pick a policy that I think can move the status quo closer to what is prescribed by shared norms of fairness. Shared norms of fairness. Another assumption, and so this is all in the book, I won't go into detail on how I make that case, because I'm constantly kind of obsessing over the fairness of the status quo, I have a running tally of its fairness, meaning I'm constantly forming beliefs on the extent to which the status quo conforms to these norms, shared norms of fairness, what these fairness norms prescribes. So I abide by a norm of fairness. Everyone agrees about the norm. And then I form beliefs about the extent to which the status quo deviates from these norms prescribed. That is just reasoning, kind of in a broader sense, reasoning according to fairness. Differences in policy preferences as captured by survey data are due not to differences in norms of fairness in my model, but differences in beliefs about the extent to which the status quo abides by what these norms prescribe. So you'll see, I'll give you a specific example in a second. And so ultimately, there's a big debate among behavioralists, we call them in political science, about whether or not people are ideologues. I don't think people are Marxists walking around with a structured ideology. But I do think people are walking around with these running tallies, these beliefs about the fairness of the status quo, and that they function as proto-ideologies, shaping how they interpret the world. Okay? So that's the leg they're standing on, the fairness leg they're standing on when they're in the world of uncertainty. When it's no longer uncertain, they shift to their self-interest leg. So it's kind of a two-leg model of how people think about these policies. So let's understand what norms of fairness we're talking about in a post-industrial economy. And I'm mostly talking about the West, and I've had conversations with folks in China on the applicability of that. Very interesting. But here I'm focusing on Western Europe. So two flavors of fairness. I'm going to capture them here with two questions. One way in which we're engaging with fairness concerns in post-industrial economies is through this first question. Are market income differences fair? That is, are market income differences mostly due to effort, merit, talent? There are, of course, tons of debate on what is merit, what is talent, etc. I'm going to keep it simple here. Is the system fair as defined by to what extent the system mostly reflects differences in effort, merit, talent, etc.? Let's call it meritocracy. Who's read Michael Young's book? You have? Okay, it's only one. It's such a good book. Anyway, so meritocracy, I'm using it, not Michael Young used it, but concept of meritocracy, that's the kind of first moral world I'm talking about here. But then there's a second way in which people are engaging or making fairness evaluation, and it's the answer to the second question. Is social solidarity done fairly? And you see here I'm European. So I am in a world where there is a welfare state that is encompassing. It means to what extent do social policies mostly reward team players, cooperators, versus are overrun by free riders, are letting free riders get away with it? And if you're in a situation where free riders get away with it, you feel it's unfair. If you're in a situation where you feel merit is not kind of what leads you to good outcome, you feel it's unfair. But these are two different flavors that you find in post-industrial democracies with a large welfare state. So the first one, I think of it as what is the norm of fairness underpinning this question? I call it the proportionality norm. I should have called it the meritocratic norm, to be honest, because I think it speaks more to people. But the principle is reward should be proportional to merit. I think of it as the moral principle underpinning market institutions. Market institutions are moral entities, and that's, to simplify, the moral norm that kind of underpins them. The reciprocity norm is the norm that says you need to punish free riders, reward cooperators, and that's the one that's at the foundation of social solidarity broadly defined. Think the welfare state. So let me show you an example of how these two norms play out differently with immigrants. Immigrants in the world of markets and in the world of the proportionality norm are actually deserving. They're hardworking. They tend to get up early. They try hard. And so most people would actually recognize that they would deserve potentially a higher income. But in the worlds of social solidarity, where there are outsiders who could potentially draw without contributing, who might have come because the benefits are higher, quote unquote, they can be framed as undeserving. Different conceptions of desert and fairness here. And so it could be unfair for them to not get a higher income in this world, but unfair for them to get social solidarity in this world. Okay, so these are the two norms I'm talking about. Any clarification questions here? Because it's important that you follow me on this. I know you guys don't do it. Do you guys do it Q&A interactive, or is it okay? Okay, yeah.
I have a question. So are you assuming that people have one or the other norm? They walk around with one or the other?
They walk around with one or the other norm is more prevalent depending on the context you're in. And to simplify, the first one is more in the rat race context, the capitalist market, a labor market, for instance. And the other one is in the social solidarity context, as experienced, for instance, with the NHS in the UK, unemployment insurance in France. Again, in the case of the US, it's not as well embodied in one specific program, but they have it and it gets triggered differently in different contexts. It's relevant differently in different contexts. Sound good? Okay, so what is interesting? Thinking about people's beliefs about the extent to which basically market institutions are meritocratic, any institutions that basically generate market income, are they meritocratic enough? That if you look in the data, people's beliefs about whether or not the status quo deviates from this norm of meritocracy are actually quite selfish. People who do well at school and end up with a higher income are more likely to think the capitalist system is fair as this norm. Like, it's in the data. Sorry, guys. You might not agree. And again, there's a lot of noise in the data, but on average, it's true. When it comes to this answer to this other question, to what extent do I think that social solidarity is fair as defined by reciprocity? It gets really messy and it's really interesting. And that's what I've been working on. So why is it messy? Well, it's messy because it's not a rat race. It's about cooperation. It's about group boundaries. And most importantly, it's about free riding. And the concept of free riding, what economists call moral hazard, is very interesting because we all have an intuitive understanding of it. But the way it plays out in practice is hard to predict. So bottom line, someone who is more likely to benefit from social solidarity because of their position in the labor market, which is on average they're poor, they're more likely to be unemployed, etc., are not more likely to think that there's not a lot of free riders. So basically, the best predictor for someone who thinks that social solidarity is fair and is not overrun by free riding is two things: whether or not you have a degree, And why is that? Because that predicts your attitudes on law and order issues. And so basically what's going on here, and I'm kind of still working on it, it sounds like the way you think about redistributive justice in the realm of social solidarity is similar to the way you think about retributive justice in the realm of law and order. And so I'm still working on this part. I'll just leave it aside for the moment. Much messier to understand. But let me show you some of the data for why this is interesting. So to try to proxy how people on average, what's the running tally on how meritocratic capitalism is, I've had to kind of deal with what I can find in survey data. So this is the British Social Attitude Survey. We'll start with these actually. They have a bunch of questions that basically ask, do you think working people are getting their fair share, right? So it's focusing on the extent to which capitalism is rewarding the kind of blue-collar hard worker versus kind of the lazy capitalist. They're a little old school questions. They were formulated in the kind of 60s and 70s, but that's the best I have. Is there one law for the rich and one for the poor? So capturing the kind of fairness of capitalism broadly defined. This is highly correlated with questions about government support for redistribution by the government, questions about tax progressivity, again, the role of the government in reducing income differences. All these items tend to go together. There's another set of items that I look at that are asking, do you think, in this case, because of what I can find, it's mostly questions about the prevalence of free riding among the unemployed. To what extent are they trying to find a job? To what extent, if they tried harder, they could find a job? To what extent the system is so generous that they end up deciding not to work? Another form of free riding. So I take these questions, I put them together, and I try to understand the extent to which you think the world is unfair from this. Is it correlated with your perceptions of the unfairness here? I must admit, when I started this project a long time ago, I expected some correlation. Basically, what this number tells you basically doing, it's called a confirmatory factor analysis, a form of measurement model. Don't worry about it. Basically, this interval, confidence interval, includes 0. There's no correlation between your propensity to answer these questions in a way that says capitalism is unfair and your probability of answering these questions as social solidarity is unfair. So what does that mean? You have a bunch of lefties who will say capitalism is unfair and the unemployment people are deserving, there's no free riding. A bunch of conservatives who think there's way too much free riding among the poor and capitalism is fair. But as big of a group are the folks who think, no, both are fine. Capitalism is fair and social society is great. And the others are like, both are unfair. The capitalists are screwing us and the poor are free riding on us. I like to think of these latter two groups as Macron type versus the far right. And it's in the data. So again, I'm giving you a bit of a schematic vision here, but that's how you should think about it. So what are the implications here? Is that in my neck of the woods, we've been thinking about support for redistribution as underpinned by questions of fairness, but usually it's saying if you want less redistribution versus more, we think of it in unidimensionally. And usually we think about morality, and this is coming out of Alessina's work more in econ, as if you think effort pays, then you're basically in favor of less redistribution. If you think effort doesn't pay, then you're in favor of more redistribution. This is actually capturing the proportionality side of the story. It's missing the social solidarity side that is also important for redistribution. And so basically, a lot of questions about redistribution are multidimensional because depending on what you're talking about, how you frame it, you can be tapping in people's beliefs about the fairness of capitalism, basically market institutions, or their beliefs about the fairness of social solidarity. And so if you're not aware of that, that's where you get weird stuff basically in the data, which is what I found in the UK. I thought there might have been a hand up, but no, we're good? Okay. So I've told you about how I think about fairness. Let's get to material self-interest. So I told you most of the time we're in the world of unknown quantities when it comes to the consequences of redistributive policies. I like to think of us as being on a continuum from Homo economicus, like in the models in econ, or Homo moralis. Uncertain, I'm here. When I start understanding how I'm affected, and I'm likely to be affected a lot, I'm more likely to be behaving in a way that's well predicted by this model. So how do we move on this continuum? Well, voters are usually more there, right? However, an entrepreneur who's entering a market is forced by market structure to behave that way, because if he behaves like a moral person, he gets kicked out of the market, right? When it comes to redistributive policies, if I'm a high-income respondent thinking about welfare cuts, this is a policy that either does not affect me, or if it does, it's through second, third order consequences to the budget. I don't really know. So I will think about welfare cuts from a moral perspective. If I'm a poor person who relies on these benefits, I'm going to be pretty rational about my attitudes and self-interested about my attitudes about these policies. Conversely, if I'm a poor person asked about tax cuts or tax increases on the top 10%, I'm going to draw from my moral beliefs about whether or not it's fair. Versus, I could be a bleeding heart liberal who thinks it's a good thing, but if suddenly I realize I'm on the wrong side of the tax increase, I might provide a more self-interested answer. Guess what? It's in the data. It's in the book. Feel free to go and check it out. It's true. But it's normal. Like, of course, when stakes are high. When I realized Piketty, how much redistribution was involved and I was going to lose about 40% of my income, I was like, exactly, that's my strategy. So basically, you see how I've got two legs, and which leg is more important is really a function of what policy, what context I'm in, etc. And so then basically the book tries to theorize change in answers to these questions. How do they happen? It can be a change in the kind of fairness beliefs that are being primed. So what fairness norm is most salient? It can be a change in fairness beliefs themselves, or it can be a change in the mix of the relative weight of fairness over self-interest. Okay? And so then I try to look for contextual factors that can trigger change in the aggregate through these three mechanisms. And then I have country cases to test them. I'm not going to go into tons of detail here. That's where I kind of push you towards the book. I'm just going to talk you through three examples in the concluding part of the talk. This one I find super interesting. One like little brief story. So basically what I find interesting, the French case, the French are usually pretty critical of capitalism and are pretty favorable towards the poor. But there's been a decline in social solidarity as picked up by these items in France. And based on the data, it seems to be tied to really sharp tax increases following the Holland presidency, because people started seeing the cost, basically, of providing kind of pro-poor answers to these questions, because suddenly there was kind of pretty sharp increase in taxes. I won't talk about this today, but just wanted to flag it. So let's go back to the original puzzles. So what's happening in Great Britain? Is it stable or declining? Well, in the case of Great Britain for that puzzle, it's just a problem of survey design. So basically what you find, it's that usually the question that asks about redistribution of income by the government, especially in the European context, is really mostly shaped by your beliefs about whether or not capitalism is meritocratic. Especially when the question talks about redistribution from the rich to the ordinary person and doesn't mention the poor, okay? So that's the BES question. It's asked in the survey. And so over time, that answer is actually pretty stable. What is happening in the BSES is that, first of all, it has the word poor in it. So it triggers people to think about free riding in the realm of social solidarity. And the question about redistribution is literally asked right after a bundle of questions about free riding, about the deservingness of the unemployed. So there's a framing effect going on here. So if it's declining, it means that beliefs about the prevalence of free riding in the realm of social solidarity are also going towards a more pessimistic side, right? It's increasingly unfair. Thus, I don't want to help the poor because there are a bunch of undeserving free riders. I turn against social solidarity. So what does the data tell us? So I showed you these bundles of items. I use them to basically try to proxy for people's running tally about the fairness of capitalism / markets, and then the fairness of social solidarity. So you have an index that someone gives mostly questions that are, yeah, it's roughly fair. For instance, there's no free riding, or to the other end, super unfair, tons of free riding. On the left, I've plotted average answers to these questions on this questions about how meritocratic capitalism is. And it's quite stable in the UK. Here I've coded it such that if it goes up, it's more unfair. Quite in this round, it's this more conservative anti-social solidarity answer. And so what you see in the British case is there's been a conservative shift in answers to questions about free riding. A bit of a reversal again after the Great Recession, but we've never come back to levels that we were basically in patterns of answers in the 80s. And so because of that shift, basically, that item is picking up on that shift. Because these beliefs about the fairness of social solidarity are moving towards it's unfair, there's a lot of free riding direction, this question about should we redistribute income from the better off to the poor is picking up on that trend. And so you're seeing a decline. I found one survey wave where this question was asked again without having right before a bunch of questions about the unemployed and the poor. And there I find a much higher support for redistribution because people don't have these beliefs primed at the time they're answering the question. So that's kind of puzzle number one. It's a typical measurement survey design issue. Here, I've taken again these proportionality beliefs, so beliefs about the extent to which income is rewarded in ways that are proportional to merit, talent, etc. And I've broken them down by whether or not you identify as a Labour voter or a Conservative. Everyone familiar enough with British politics? Centre left, centre right. And broke them down by income. So what do you notice? Rich people have, on average, they think the system is fair and meritocratic, more so than the poor. Okay. Yes, there are some party differences. Interestingly, the income gap is bigger among the Conservatives here. But basically, there is an income gradient and things are pretty stable over time. And the Conservatives, on average, are more likely to think the system is fair as defined by the proportionality norm. Now, let me show you the exact same analysis, but focusing on these reciprocity beliefs. So here, things flip. It's actually low-income folks who are more likely to think that this social solidarity is unfair because of a lot of free riders. The rich on the, not a big gap, okay? But the rich are more likely, again, this is coded where if you have lower values, there's less free riding, higher values, more free riding. You can see again these trends, okay? Still also in the Conservative Party, not as marked as in the Labour Party. So these are these beliefs, okay? These are beliefs that are going to shape how you think, for instance, about cuts to welfare. I'll finish that sentence and I'll come to you. So if my theory is right, remember I said that rich people, when they think about cuts to welfare, they're most likely to put their moral homo moralis hat on. So if this is true, the change in beliefs should affect the answers to questions about welfare cuts more so for the rich than for the poor. Everyone's following me here? You have a question?
So just to clarify, so that lower income people tend to believe that, tend to doubt social solidarity or view. Do you think, why do you suppose that is? Like, do you think as beneficiaries of the welfare state, they're more likely to see abuse or problems in it?
That hypothesis has been tested, but it's hard to find. So if you look at variation in proximity to even recipients, which you could say is potentially proportional to proximity to abuse, there's no evidence of that. Here, literally, at least in my data, it's mechanically tied to the fact that low-income people are more likely to be from occupations that are more likely to be what we call authoritarian on law and order questions, which I hate that concept. But they're more likely to want kind of tough laws and to constantly think that people are they need stiffer sentences. People are abusing. Like again, I'm still working on what that means, but that's partly why lower income seem less trustful of social solidarity. Okay, that's what's driving this here. Not an explanation, just a correlation. So going back to my relationship again, here, it should be high income, we're more behaving like moral individuals, and low income, we're more kind of thinking about cuts to welfare in a more self-interested way. What do we notice? So on the left, this is the full sample. You realize that when people are asked, do you favor a cut in welfare? The less than 20% of the bottom quintile support that, and it's pretty stable over time. It's not going up. The big action is happening in the top 20% of the income distribution because fairness beliefs have changed there, and that is translating. The homo moralis, it's translating in different answers to welfare cuts. It's happening in both parties. The structure is a little different, but the rich are shifting in both parties. The recovery is a little faster among high-income labor folks here, not among conservatives, okay? So what is interesting here is that, actually, I'm going to come to that later. So why is that interesting? Because it kind of provides me a segue with explaining what's happening with the income gradient in the United States. So remember, I told you that there was a decline in the income gradient in the United States. What is driving that? So the usual story, and I just keep fighting against any journalist who kind of reaches to me on this topic, they always say, isn't this a story of low-income white voters, who are turning against redistribution because of racial resentment? And so the idea, why would this income gap be decreasing? It's because support for redistribution is going down among the poor and kind of converging towards that of the rich because it's going to these minorities that are lazy, blah, 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 blah. According to my story, actually, no. It should be the rich folks who are more moral when they think about. So the one assumption here that I don't have time to take in detail, but in the American context, when you guys think about redistribution, it's usually welfare. So it's usually about stuff that go to the poor. It's more means tested, etc. So in this context, the rich are more likely to have their moral hat on. This is not a question about taxing the rich, okay? This is a question about redistribution to the poor. And so in this context, it should actually be driven by high-income white voters who for some reason find social solidarity fair, that are actually converging towards the poor in their level of support for redistribution or opposition to cuts or a decrease in social solidarity. And this is what's happening. So here, basically, I've taken the item that I told you about on income redistribution in the GSS. I've broken it down by income and by party. Basically, what do you see? There's a general trend in the Republican Party to kind of move towards less support for redistribution. However, support for redistribution here, how did I code it here? Yeah, so here, sorry, it's not very consistent across graph. Here, it's my low-income folks, and it's the percentage who think the government should redistribute income. So among Republicans, poor Republicans are more likely to agree that there should be income redistribution, especially relative to rich Republicans. There's a strong gap. Overall, there is a move towards less support, but there's a strong gap, strong income gradient. Where there's been a change in income differences that is driving the overall change I showed you, it's among Democrats, where you're seeing a huge increase in support for redistribution among high-income Democrats to the point where now they're undistinguishable from low-income Democrats. And actually, it's not a story of low-income support among low-income whites. It's actually a story of increase in support among bleeding heart liberals, to simplify a little bit. The last stuff, the goal of this book is explaining the missing left turn. And so I'll just conclude on that and tell you, please ask me more because it's actually a more complicated story than it sounds. So why are we not seeing a missing left turn? Why don't people care about redistribution as their context is changing around them? So first of all, to the extent that you're in a world of uncertainty and you're relying on these fairness beliefs are actually pretty hard to change. The UK is the only country I found with quite good evidence that there was a change in fairness beliefs. Again, think of them as assets. You invest in the vision of the world. You're not going to suddenly update it. And it's hard to update these things. And so part of the disconnect between what's happening in the economy and mass attitudes is that we rely on our fairness beliefs. They're pretty stable. And so they have these stabilizing properties to public opinion. And they generate a wedge between what's happening in the real world and policy preferences. So here, to believe me that they're stable, I can show you the data. But let me show you something else that's interesting here. So remember how I showed you at the individual level that if I know how you answer a bunch of questions about the prevalence of free riding among the poor, I cannot predict how you're going to answer questions about the fairness of capitalism and, the market economy, etc. That was at the individual level. Now let's do the exact same analysis and move it to the country level. So I've ordered countries as to what extent on average people in this country think that there's less versus more free riding, and to what extent I'm in a country where I think capitalism is unfair versus fair. So let's take here two countries, France and Denmark. Denmark is a country that is at a similar level on this measure than the US in how it thinks about the fairness of capitalism. So it's two ways to find the status quo fair. You might say that the Danes have a better case if they went to the a court of truth or something. But both of them are looking at their status quo as fair. Okay? The French, on the other hand, and anyone who's been to the country knows that, it's like you just can't convince them that capitalism can get anything right, especially not a fair distribution of income. However, another key difference between Denmark and France is in terms of how they perceive social solidarity. The Danes also think that social solidarity is roughly done fairly on average, at least more so than the French. The French on this are closer to the Polish folks, which again, I don't know Eastern Europe that well, but it's kind of very similar patterns of answers. So why is this important? Think about Macron, who, advised by Jean Tirole, a Nobel Prize, has really been advocating for a flex security model in the French case that says, unleash the forces of capitalism on the market, but have this generous social insurance model, unemployment model in particular. Well, this is a type of policy that is perfect in the Danish case, because they trust that if you unleash the forces of capitalism, it will be done in a fair way. And they trust that if you help the folks who don't succeed under that policy, they won't be free riding. So that kind of policy in the French context, where they neither trust capitalism nor social solidarity, is not going to stick. It didn't stick. It kind of has stuck in weird ways, but it was helped by COVID, if you ask me, because it kind of killed a lot of the opposition. These fairness beliefs are not just stabilizing everything, they're shaping the ability of different types of policies to stick, basically. And so here I took the example of flex security. So why no missing left turn? Again, if you think basically of countries into kind of moral equilibriums, kind of stabilizes everything. And this is where I'm just going to say, ask me later. But if you study the equilibrium, how these fairness beliefs are distributed across political parties, you realize that it's much more in the interest, especially of the center left, to mobilize people on let's redistribute to social solidarity in a fair way. However, if you're interested in redistributing income dramatically, you should be tackling what Hacker calls pre-distribution. You should be tackling how markets are generating inequality in the first place. And there, it's really hard to build coalition for these types of policies. So even if the demand side is pretty flat, on the kind of supply side, it's hard for politicians to find political solutions in favor of pretty radical kind of redistributive policies. Again, I'm happy to show you the data later, but that's kind of the main insight. So there we go. Plenty more in the book. Let's do it. Q&A.
As ever, I am the bearer of the mic, but only to give it to the next person who wants to ask a question. Who's first?
Thank you so much. I will definitely add the book to the increasingly long list of books I need to read. I guess this question is more like a clarification question. Just wanting to make sure I understand the takeaways correctly. It's like towards the end of the presentation, you're contrasting your story with like the traditional story of like racial resentment, right? Where we kind of think like you associate African Americans with welfare, and then therefore your attitudes towards Black people shape your attitudes towards welfare. And so I guess where I'm kind of lost is like when you kind of look at the racial resentment measure, though, there's like a lot of different issues, right? People often kind of claim that's just kind of capturing general conservatism, and then we kind of get back into like the ideologue story. And so kind of, this might be like long-winded, I'm going to apologize. So I guess like going back to the beginning of your presentation, are you kind of saying that people are ideologues, that these are like economic individualism, or like these attitude towards the welfare state is stable? And then is so far as like the liberal story then just like that people have like similar instance, or like both Democrats, Republicans believe certain policies affect certain groups the same way, but then the attitudes towards that group just shape it? Or like, I guess I'm just trying to figure out.
Yeah. So there's two ways to think about this. One is to say the model, and that's why a lot of my grant proposals fail, because I have an Americanist that says exactly like that. It's all about who do you think is the group benefiting from these policies? And it's all about your affect toward this group that then. And I'm like, yes, in the American context, that is one way through which your fairness beliefs form. I can tell you in the British context, the welfare queen until basically the Romas was white. It was a white lady who had 3 kids. I mean, I don't know if you remember the newspapers in the 90s. So the extent to which these beliefs get racialized is an outcome of the political process. And so a lot of that literature just assumes it's true across the world. And it's like, no, it's true in the American context. It's an outcome. So my answer to you is yes, you're right. It's feeding into how these beliefs form in the American context. It's not true across all cases, okay? If you want to work on that, great, do it. I'm more interested in kind of stepping back and thinking, how can I provide a framework that thinks about these phenomena in countries beyond the US where these things are not racialized yet? We haven't converged to that. And so instead of defining it, so the literature, it's going to be a mix of symbolic racism, I guess it's called now, the index, right? That's the word I can remember. Yeah, okay.
Is it like political cultures where you're trying to actually take away that?
So I am trying to step back and not just think about the American context where you're like individualist values and then symbolic racism. And I'm saying, no, these things are feeding into 2 broader concepts, which are beliefs about the extent to which the status quo deviates from these norms of fairness. And when you think about that, you realize that France is much more like the US than you would think, right? Basically. Does that help a little bit? Thanks.
Thank you for this really interesting talk. I wanted to hear what you had to say about Luke's and how he fits into this. So Luke's it's about power and how power influences beliefs. So I want to hear about the role of power and influencing beliefs.
So I'll send you, if you want, I'll send you the piece. So basically, Luke's, for you guys who haven't read it in like your field seminar or something, has the 3 faces of power. The first face is, I'm going to hit you. Like I'm not, but I can exert something on you. There's a kind of visible exertion of power, and you're going to end up doing something like leaving the room that you wouldn't have done if I hadn't exerted it on you. The second face is I'm controlling you because I'm not even allowing for your grievances to be expressed. And then the third face is you don't even know you have grievances in the first place. Like, would you agree with my? So basically the piece says, there are some bargaining models. So my neck of the political economy is political economy defined as the tools of econ applied to the study of politics. Not exactly my preferred definition, but that's where I ended up in the sociology of the field. And so the first phase, there are models of bargaining that can get at that, whatever. Acemoglu has stuff on this to an extent. The second stuff is all these nice models on the extent to which if you add a second dimension, it's really hard to do kind of radical redistribution. And then the third, which is this, and so it's basically trying to understand how are people's beliefs formed in a way that makes certain types of policies unsustainable. And I think where my work differs from Luke's is as I was writing this and doing this research, you could see how you could come to a combination of fairness beliefs that are inhospitable to radical policies that would actually objectively benefit some groups in society, without having a big bad wolf, without having, in the case of Gaventa, the local mine landlord who was, or in the case of Gramsci, some kind of, it's just societies have a need for justification. So we have norms of fairness to justify stuff to each other. We need to form fairness beliefs because otherwise it's just hard we all are proto-ideological in some fashion. And you can have equilibrium outcomes. That's where I'm a bit of an econ, I guess, where without even some kind of danger, some kind of them controlling the kind of beliefs that form, that can be inhospitable to redistribution. So in that sense, I'm looking at the role of ideas, mass ideas, in putting some issues off the agenda. Where I think I thought was interesting in doing that exercise is that I don't think you need an organized elite to still get that outcome, I guess. Does that answer your question? There was a hand up. Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So to think about like general takeaways and how to like apply this in the real world. If you're saying that like, wow, like people are less disposed to like redistribute through welfare because they think they're free riders, but then more people are thinking that capitalism is unfair. So do you see like labor and redistribution of wealth via higher wages, maybe limit or like limits on like executive compensation and like more worker strikes as a way to redistribute wealth, if not through like welfare?
Yeah. So several things. So one, a simple insight is when you're talking to someone, then they're telling you something, try to think, are they more homo moralis or are they more homo economicus? So at a minimum, just one little thing you can use for yourself is to try and understand to what extent am I likely to deal with a group of people who are going to think about this policy as something personal or not? And if it's not, what are their fairness beliefs? And so what's interesting with social solidarity is that actually a coalition to expand social solidarity is one that brings people who benefit from these new policies and know it, and it's high stakes for them, and a bunch of bleeding heart liberals who think it's the fair things to say, especially if you don't tell them how much they're going to pay, right? So, and that's Obamacare. Like Obamacare kind of leveraged that model pretty well. You're asking something about, so what else? So first of all, I'm not talking about wealth. It's about income. And wealth is different. And so actually I was talking to Mark about this. And so to that extent, it's another project. So you're asking me, so what kind of policies should we mobilize on to some extent? And so either you kind of take the status quo for what it is, and it's the package we've seen on the center left, which is a mix of equal opportunity. Let's make the market even fairer than it is, which is kind of cute, but not great at addressing inequality, combined with these kind of pretty expansive welfare policies. Remember, not everyone thinks there's a lot of free riding, right? So the fact that some do, there's a lot of people who think social solidarity is fair. And so it's the kind of typical center-left mix of equal opportunity and generous welfare for the deserving, the kids, for while single mothers used to be deserving. I think this is kind of changing to some extent. If you want to disrupt this, I think you basically need a much more dramatic disruption. And so in that sense, collective organizing, it's not in favor of a specific policy. It's in favor of disrupting the supply side. So you need to add a party or you need to, one version of Piketty's, you need to change the elites that are in charge of different parties. I'll show you the graph then. Then I'll become a bit less specific. So let's show you the incentive structure here. So this is the UK. I'm going to continue on the British case, but it's kind of similar in the US. Okay, and one thing on the US though, so what if you take the role of fairness very seriously, under what condition do you have a functioning system? It's a system where everyone agrees on norms of fairness, and on average, there's a majority who thinks the status quo is fair. How do you get change? That's stable. That's the Danes, right? We have the same norm and we think the system is fair. You can get change if suddenly you shift from a majority who thinks it's fair to a majority who thinks it's unfair. We're still using the same norm, and then a majority slowly shifts to different policies. When did we get a shift? Usually during a world war, where perceptions of the deservingness of the rich and the capacity of capitalism to deliver for shifted. But pretty dramatic event. And then there's another situation where you have a bimodal distribution, where there's just two groups who are fundamentally thinking about the status quo differently. And I think the polarized two-party system in the US has generated that kind of situation, which to me sounds extremely unstable. I don't know how you run a system that way. So that's the more meta. Now, going back to the British case here, just to illustrate my point. So this is the Labour Party, and this is the poor and the rich, bottom quintile, top quintile, same story. And then I've plotted, these are beliefs about the fairness of social solidarity, reciprocity beliefs, and these are beliefs about basically the fairness of market income, proportionality beliefs. So what do you notice here? I'm a leader of the Labour Party, and I'm seeing that my poor and my rich are actually disagreeing quite a lot on the fairness of capitalism, not so much on the fairness of social solidarity. Bleeding heart liberals love social solidarity, okay? Well, I'm not going to start doing radical interventions on the market because I'm going to lose my rich folks here. They don't think it's fair. All they think is you need a bit more fair markets. They don't think you need to kind of disrupt the way income is generated on markets. So I'm just going to focus on this. And that's what you've seen in the British context. A lot of the dynamics is actually happening on these issues. So when you're asking me what to do next, like if you want to maintain a kind of electoralist model of politics and a democracy, you want the leaders of the left to potentially get out of that tension. How do you do that? I don't know. I'm just diagnosing.
Just
here.
a quick 2 cents on this one, but that's Bjorn Bremer's point, that essentially that's what they looked at and they got it wrong. Because if you target the bottom, you might lose some of the top, but there's just more at the bottom. and they've become more disaffected and withdrawn from politics. So it's actually not just a structural fact, it's a strategic error to read that diagram that way. That would be Bjorn's point about Britain. That you can target the poor, there's more of them, it's just that they don't vote for you anymore.
Yes, okay.
Right?
Yes.
You can bring them back in by targeting them as
yeah.
opposed to just pandering to the same people who are basically on the same level as the Conservative bottom quintile.
But you could see why you're not just doing this because the party's captured by some elite. You're doing this because your elite is also in favor of social solidarity.
Yeah, exactly.
They're lefties in some ways. That's what I mean. So it's not just...
Right, but if they wanted to win, that would be what you would do. It's not impossible to win.
But that's the thing. I don't know, because to what extent you would lose these guys?
Doesn't matter if you lose them.
Fine.
I mean, we can talk later, but I mean, this is where the Brahmins piece becomes really interesting because they've got nowhere else to go.
Yeah, that is true.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. So I have two questions, if that's all right.
Yeah.
The first being, in that chart you showed about Democrats and Republicans' attitudes on various issues. Yeah. So this is testing their expressed beliefs when asked survey questions, right? So do you fear that this will be complicated when policies are implemented? For example, that if there's a higher progressive taxation, which is then used to fund things like a subsidy for families, that could lose affluent Democrats from the coalition or gain lower income Republicans. And if you have a feeling on that, which do you think there's more to lose or more to gain?
Yeah. So yes, basically. And again, these are, if I had a Democrat strategist in the room, they'll get all nitty gritty with me on like surveys, blah, blah, blah. So there's two conclusions. One, survey data is shite. Excuse my French. Like it's just, so it's a theory on how people answer surveys, but it's also as a result informative on the fact that we have these two hats, and sometimes we say what's fair and sometimes, but when it's high stakes, like we do the self-interested thing and it's rational, right? And so, but your question is, to what extent would you gain more poor folks relative to the kind of rich? So who knows, right? And it's like, that's hard to measure, but this is totally anecdotal and totally not. But like the more I look at what's happening with the tech people moving to the Republican Party, the more I think this is what happened, because Biden and others did actually try to do a bit of redistribution and like they disappeared in a snap. It was enough to just have a little peak and whoop, they were gone. And so to the extent that your system that's funded on money and, well, that's going to be more costly to you. So I think there is a trade-off. In political systems where money is not that important, actually, where there are true caps to campaign limits and stuff, where they don't have another party to go to. Well, I'm trying to think, where would they go to believe how was the British case? They would go to the Tories, I think. Yeah, or the Greens, yeah. But the point is, you need to make,
because they're British Greens, not Greens in general. They're a weird bunch. Believe it or not.
Yeah, they're in a few cities. Yeah. But yeah, so if I was a risk-averse person, I would think the trade-off, like it's not. And also you have to realize, like, it's not enough to just tell people we're going to do policies that are going to benefit you. Like, I need to believe you. I need to wait for the whole policy cycle. And so ultimately, it's going to take the experience of receiving something to create a constituency. That's what Roosevelt understood, FDR understood really well. And the second question,
My second question is, do you think like mass immigration can threaten social solidarity in a way that diminishes support for redistribution, and in a high trust society like Denmark or in a low trust society like America?
Yeah, so it's my second book project that's nearly finished. So if you go on my website, you'll find some papers.
Okay, so I have a lot of books to buy now.
There's a Journal of Economic Literature piece where I basically say immigration is not a threat to the welfare state. In Europe, here, we'll talk about the US in a second, the welfare state is a threat to immigration, right? And so why is that? Is that, yes, people might not want to share and do social solidarity with immigrants and develop beliefs that make them think that social solidarity is done unfairly because it's going to immigrants and kind of feeding into that declining trust and perception that the system's fair. But it's also in a context where these programs are so generous and affect our lives and we're receiving them, self-interest is going to make you want to fight back. And it's going to feed what we call in Europe welfare chauvinism, right? So it's this idea that we want as or more redistribution, but for us. And so the far right has moved to that program now. The AfD is a bit of a mixed bunch for the moment, but maybe what's her name? I can't, the W. Yeah, anyway. But on average, and so in that sense, I don't think it's a threat because immigration came after the welfare state. America is a case where diversity, it's not diversity, slavery and racial hierarchy came before the welfare state. And so to some extent, immigration to me is not having whatever impact it's having on American society, it's not happening through the debate on the welfare state because the welfare state is either not big enough or too well closed, right? It's actually hard for immigrants to access most social benefits here. In Europe, in the UK, you step foot on the territory, you have access to the NHS. It's kind of amazing. I was trying to pay. Every time I go, it's like, let me pay something. I'm not paying. It's impossible. They don't even have a receipt. And so in that sense, that's key for Europe. But again, it's more the welfare state that's a threat for immigration. So the presence of a large welfare state is reshaping immigration policy. And so Denmark has done quite a lot of moves excluding immigrants from accessing the welfare state. And even the European Union, which used to be the backstop, is kind of now backtracking. And so kind of basic social rights are mostly guaranteed for European Union immigrants, not people outside the European Union. Yeah.
Thank you for the excellent research. I really find the proportionality and reciprocity dimension interesting. When in reality, like people having this kind of beliefs, for example, if I'm thinking about redistribution, welfare policy, I think about my relative position along the income rank. So I'm both thinking redistribution from and redistribution to. So in reality, do people really like disentangle these two dimensions? And my second question is, in this graph of different countries have these variations with regard to proportionality and reciprocity norms. How do you explain this variation in a coherent theoretical framework? For example, in UK, you have this survey priming effect. Does it does it exist in France, for example? And France have this kind of fiscal pressure, but in the same time, you could also have austerity for a long time, also experiencing fiscal pressure. So how do we explain this kind of country variations in terms of these two norms?
Okay, well, these are. So first of all, so your first question, so do people disentangle? So no, right? And so again, it depends. That's what's so interesting because some policies are asked in a way that trigger both. And so you ask them one day and the conversation goes in one direction and the next day it can go in the other. And so you see variation. However, where I do think they disentangle is that thinking in terms of free riding and social solidarity on policies that interfere with, let's call them pre-distribution policies that interfere with the generation of market income. It makes no sense. Capitalism and markets are designed, that's the whole point of the invisible hand. There's no conception of solidarity, right? And so there are contexts where some beliefs are totally make no sense even to form or to think about it. But let's think about moments where this is not true. So remember when Obama said, you didn't build this. Do you remember? I don't know if you guys, some of you are a bit too young, but basically I think it was a fundraising dinner or something. And he said, he tried to frame capitalism not as a rat race, a fair rat race, but as a communal cooperative project through public goods, through public education, etc. And it was a big outrage because people saw that if you start thinking and talking about this as a solidarity project, things are going to look very different in terms of what norms of fairness, how you kind of frame who owes what to whatever. And so, in the American context, it was just not even a possibility. And so thinking historically, what are the moments where markets can be framed as true solidarity projects? Well, it's when markets are used to fund a war against an existential threat. And so again, I come back to the wars as these really rare moments where the norm of reciprocity can be used more in that realm. Okay. So then your other question, why countries differ? I don't know. Seriously, I don't know. That's where my contribution is super small, right? It's just organizing things. And so I can make sense of variation with a pretty parsimonious format. Why do different countries I tend to think more like an economist there, in the sense that I think about fairness beliefs as an empirical manifestation of what I call a moral apparatus. And so in that sense, I'm very functionalist. I think about the role of norms and culture as fostering minimum certainty, meaning you're filling the gap of uncertainty when you don't know how you're going to be impacted, and generating a common shared reality where dissent is channeled through these norms of fairness, right? And so in that sense, that stabilizes stuff. Why some countries stabilize on one equilibrium or the other, I don't know. We don't have enough countries. I'm a bit of a quant there, and so I'm like, sorry. But if you have ideas, at least of some mechanisms, except for wars, I haven't found one yet.
Hey, this is great. I just have one question that I think maybe it was a limitation of your data to not explore this, but just to ask about it, is whether you looked at the relationship between, on both of these axes, their kind of mediation or correlation with social trust, political trust, and institutional trust. And then, so that's one question. And then the other question is just about the GSS. It's a one item measure, and you used 2 scalar indexes for in the British case. Is that right?
Yeah, so you mean there were way more items?
Way more items in the British case, and you just use a single item measure in the GSS.
Yeah.
And did you encounter any things with priming in the ordering in the GSS, or to look at maybe, instances where they had a module where you could do?
Yeah, so I didn't find any, but partly because, interestingly, all the deservingness items were all about race, basically, and unfortunately it's not comparable. And so here, basically, how did I position the country? So first of all, for this, I had a bunch of stuff in the world value study where I tried to extract, it was complicated, but so I managed. For this one, what I did is that a bunch of sociologists at NYU replicated the ESS 1 year for the US. I was lucky, it was around that time. And so it's this one data set that I found. However, there is this one Pew data that I found. It's here. So here what I did is I took a bunch of items. I call them proportionality beliefs, but it's basically items on do you trust business? Do you think business? So it's a bit like the same items in the UK, but it's talking about business. And so here I rank you, it's standardized from you don't trust business to you trust it. And then there was one item that says, do you think too many people are on benefits? Which implicitly I assume was capturing your perceptions that if there's too many, it's because of free riding, it's because you think there's moral hazard, etc. What do you notice? There's no correlation between how you think about businesses and how you answer these questions about benefits. So that's my way of trying to get at a similar disconnect in the US case, given that the data's. So what about the GSS item? So that's it's the only one that I have. And so, but I didn't find any, there couldn't be framing effects because there's literally not of these types of bundles of questions asked, unless it's about race, and I didn't want to go down that route. You asked another question there.
Yeah, the question was about trust. So about social trust, political trust, and institutional trust, and whether you could measure that, and if not, whether you have hypotheses about it.
So basically, I'm walking out of this project thinking, okay, trust is about perceptions of the fairness of the status quo, which I find a much more functional definition of trust than the one that is just, I trust, right? And so at least trust in the realm of political science and how it's studied. So I think the two are very related, and I want to look what the study of trust and the findings from the literature would look like through the lens of thinking about measuring deviations, identifying the norms of fairness that are relevant to this institution, and then measuring beliefs about whether or not that institution complies with whatever norms important. And that to me would be a better way of studying trust than I think the way we've done, do you trust? And then you just assume that people have the same thing in mind without kind of unpacking what it is. I totally agree with you. I said I can't explain these different countries, but what is holding them together? So here, these are countries that, again, on law and order items, look very authoritarian, which my French people disappointed me on this one a little bit. again, versus kind of very liberal on these items. So going back to your question again, so if you break the data down by generations, the generations that are both less authoritarian and more likely to think social solidarity is fair are the generations that have been exposed to the welfare state, right? That have lived longer time. So there is, of course, institutions generate the beliefs that enable their replication, right? Of course, if it's done right and all the literature on trust on how do you converge to that equilibrium, it's like that the literature is still working on it. But yeah, there's a huge overlap here. So if you're working on this, I'm happy to chat because I've got tons of ideas on how to push it forward. Yeah, thanks.
A little while ago, Bo Rothstein in Gothenburg had the quality of government stuff.
Yeah.
Did you try and use any of these data to basically check that out? Because essentially that's what he's trying to get at, which is, why do you get these high trust societies? Because the quality of government is better. What do we mean by the quality of government? Here are my indicators. There might be something to pull through that. I mean, my favorite example of this is the most popular part of the Swedish government when you survey them is the tax office. No, this is not a joke. It really is the most popular part of the government, right? Yeah. And then, you go to Hungary, you're not going to be surprised if you get the exact opposite. So there might be something in that.
So I remember looking at it actually and thinking I just didn't have enough because I needed to do countries and within country specific institutions. And I just didn't have, I would have to do a very specific data collection process because ultimately I'm looking at this from 10,000 feet high, right? I'm trying to organize, but I'm not. And yeah, so Bo Rothstein has influenced me on this for sure. Stein or Steen? I don't know. Stein. Okay. But I remember looking and thinking, damn it won't work because I don't have enough variance, but I should look again. Yeah.
Well, we have time for two more, because we've got three more. Good God, why kill the conversation?
Thank you so much. I love the book. My question is about scope conditions. So I'm wondering to what extent your theory might travel to the global south. So two things on my mind in particular are if fairness norms are a function of development, then people in the developing world might have a different set of norms than in the developed world, and B, people in the developing world might have the same set of norms, but they care too much about the bread and butter issues to be salient about those beliefs when evaluating these decisions. So thank you.
So I totally agree with the latter, actually. I think you're right in the sense that being able to behave like a homo moralis is a luxury good, right? And so to what extent, and that's to some extent Inglehart's point about growth and shifting to post-materialist values, etc. The first point, I don't think I'll be able, because we don't have the data, because I came to this inductively, so you need a lot of data to try to think about it that way. I don't think I can incorporate the global south in a way that I could be like, it's more this norm or blah, blah, blah. However, I think there's a way to study how the norms that we observe in the Western context travel or not to other contexts. And so here I have China and Singapore in mind. So China, for instance, on some measures, look like they're really following the meritocratic norm. So in simple setups, they will make sure that the person who's worked harder gets more of the income. So there's a lot of these behavioral stuff. But there's a really interesting one where they put parents in front of kids, where some kids got more cookies randomly, or they got more cookies because they worked hard at it. The Swedes will look at the random outcome and redistribute the cookies across the kids. The Chinese parents don't touch the cookies. So that there are these cultural differences where there might be general sense of effort should pay, but then how people think about luck, or how they think about once you've got something, can I take it from you, seem to vary a lot culturally. And so at a minimum, trying to understand cross-national variation in this basic norm of meritocracy would be a good way to, in a structured fashion, start thinking more globally about norms of fairness and in this context. Singapore, this is a super recent project. Anyone has been to Singapore by any chance? It seems like they're freaking out over bottlenecks. Like the meritocratic system is on coke over there, and it's like everyone, it's like the Young book, right? And so this microcosm where you can study when you have a system that everyone thinks is super fair, but it's kind of reached its end goal because it's not able to deliver upward mobility to everybody because there's just too many people with a college degree, not enough good position. And then there's a lot of foreigners coming in with better skills, et cetera, et cetera. Like what happens in this kind of control condition? That would be like super interesting. So that's my only ideas of like meso projects to try to think about these things more systematically. Big picture, I don't know. I would need to live in each of these countries and I don't have time.
Thank
you. I'll bring it. Our guests don't have to move.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I didn't actually. Thanks.
Thank you for the excellent lecture, and thank you for hanging out for those few of us that are.
Of course. This is great.
Two questions. The first is rhetorical, which is, does enhancing attendance by free lunch a form of income redistribution? And if you surveyed that by country over time, what would that look like? The second and more serious, when you use the term income redistribution, or as it's generally understood, you're talking transfer payments, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm
not
asking,
only, but yes.
Not as an academic,
yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with that, as they say on Seinfeld. I'm asking as a post-retirement anti-poverty practitioner, in the sense that I've done hours and hours and hours of work, both in financial literacy education and in particular offering free tax preparation services to income qualified individuals. Many thousands of those. I'm also on 2 boards of directors for social service agencies. One works to integrate the formerly incarcerated. The other works with mostly unwed mothers and children in the Roxbury and North Dorchester neighborhoods. Okay. So my perspective is different, and this is all very interesting, but a couple of observations or propositions from my experience. The first is, since the Great Society, we have spent how many gajillions of dollars in transfer payments of one sort or another? And by the way, Section 8 vouchers are a de facto transfer payment, and so on and so forth.
Can we have a question rather than a lecture? Because we're running out of time here. Thank you very much.
You want me to wrap it up?
Get to the questions you can answer.
Okay, why don't I maybe I'll just stop here. But
just ask the question. Just ask the question that you can answer.
Okay, why don't we'll stop.
No, but I think there's one thing. So you're totally right in the sense of redistribution I'm talking about is not just transfer payment. To some extent, the conclusion of the book is, given that if I could simplify a little bit, there was a time where a lot of the political competition was around what is the type of institution that will generate the kind of market income, the one you get through your work, through your working life, that will be fair, that we could all agree on. And so some went all the way to communism and some went all the way, and we ended up somewhere more towards the market side. Today, a lot of the competition is around these transfers to the poor, social solidarity, et cetera. If you care about inequality, these are actually not the policies. They redistribute, but they don't redistribute that efficiently. And that's Bo Rothstein's actually work also. And so if you point that, what am I talking about when I talk about redistribution? I'm talking about what's asked in surveys, because that's what politicians are talking about. And I'm trying to understand why why some things are not being talked about, basically, also. And so if you point that these policies, we've done it, and it's not working, to some extent I agree. And so part is understanding why is it hard for other types of proposals, why some have disappeared and why some don't emerge, other definitions of redistribution, more ambitious potentially. So I don't know if that is where you were going, but that's kind of what the thought, your point triggered.
It wasn't a point, it was a question, but yes, that's where I was going.
Okay, thanks.
There are tens of millions of Americans who are not thriving, not because capitalism is mean, but because they have nothing to offer, either by virtue of their educational background, their family circumstances from which they came, and the dysfunction, substance
But
abuse.
you could say that's mean capitalism. Like, it's capitalism who decided they had nothing to offer, right? I mean,
and so forth.
I think
And
Yeah.
if income
okay.
redistribution is just more transfer payments, that doesn't seem to solve anything.
Yeah, it's a simplification.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.